Hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving and enjoyed to spend time with family and friends. We certainly did. Had all three of our kids in and their significant others and their dogs. That somebody didn't warn me about the fact that pets came with, and I'm just learning that. But we had a great time. Really enjoyed getting to hang out with them, and obviously enjoyed the food. Lenore worked many masterpieces, as you can imagine, and her daughters and son helped her, and it was a great time. We really did. I started a new regimen this morning that maybe some of you did too. I got up this morning and I did some stretching. I did some meditating. I did some aerobic dance, and I did some breathing exercises, and all of that was just to get my pants buttoned. So it was kind of something this time of year we all have to get into and get going. I visibly saw my family roll their eyes when I did that. But it really is that time of year where it's time you look at it and you go, yeah, I'm gonna have to cut back, and that's for certain. It wasn't difficult though, and maybe you shared the same vision I did as I sat at the table around Thanksgiving. We had again all of our children and their significant others, and my daughter-in-law had her parents come from Cersei, and they had a little foster baby with them, and just a full table full of people, full of family, and that kind of a thing. It's not hard to look at that setting and struggle to find something that you're thankful for, right? When you look out at your kids and you see, I've seen several people post on social media the little phrase that says, happiness is seeing that your children are good people. And man, we experience that. I mean, we experience that every day, to look at the kids that God has blessed us with and realize that despite our shortcomings, despite my weaknesses and my struggles, God worked in my children to make them good people. And man, I'm thankful. I really am. And I know you are too, as you look out at your table and you see that. One of the things as I write this lesson that I realize is one of the things I'm thankful for is that I don't get what I deserve. You know what I'm saying? When I look at again, my struggles and shortcomings, when I look at where I struggle, when I see sometimes the direction my life goes and the choices I make, that I look back and say, man, that wasn't the right choice. I'm happy, I'm thankful that I don't get what I deserve. Because probably what I deserve is just to be alone. I don't deserve to have God surround me with the people that He surrounded me with. That includes you all. I don't deserve to have the family, the friends, the people who are around me, but God has blessed me with that despite the fact that I don't deserve it. And I think it's important for us to look at that sometimes and realize that we don't deserve what we've been given. That the things God has blessed us with, He's blessed us with in spite of our shortcomings, in spite of our weaknesses, in spite of how we've struggled and how we've sinned before Him. And we can be thankful that God does not give us what we deserve, but gives us far more, abundantly more than we deserve, and that what our deeds have warranted. How do we thank Him for that? How do we thank Him for those blessings? Our series up to this point has been Experience Worship. It's been on worshiping God and acknowledging the fact that worship isn't something that just happens once on Sunday for an hour on Sunday. That worship is something that we take into our week, that we do daily, expressing our praise, our thanks, and our obedience to God. And one of the ways that we're going to look at this morning in which we express our thanks is through generous giving. What we choose to give. If you agree with me that what God has given you is not what you deserve, it's far above and beyond, then you might also agree that He would expect us to give as we've been prospered, as we've been given to. As He's blessed us, that we're to reach out and bless others. As you might imagine, there's a precedent in that. that idea of returning what you've been, a portion of what you've been given. It started in the earliest times of the Old Testament. The idea of setting aside a portion of what you've been given and giving it to others. The story of Abraham meeting Melchizedek in Genesis. Melchizedek was the king of Jerusalem, and he was also a priest of God. Yahweh God. We don't understand exactly where all that comes from or how all that works out. But when he and Abraham met, it was after Abraham had pursued some people who had taken his nephew Lot and his family into captivity and were sweeping them off as the spoils of war. Abraham pursued them, overtook them, wiped out the people who had taken them away, and then everything that they had became his. And as he was coming back, he met this Melchizedek. And when he found out that they served the same God and that they worshiped the same God, Abraham gave him a tenth of everything that he had. Just gave it to him out of respect for what he did. And that kind of started a tradition, as you see it moving forward, of this idea of 10%. It's kind of an interesting parallel there between what Abraham did and the laws that came after that. Just before the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, they had left Egypt. The Egyptian army was pursuing them. They were still reeling from what had just happened. I can't imagine what it would have been like. We're going to talk a lot in January and beyond about our next series after the holidays is going to be Exodus. We're going to be talking about this, what happened during those times. But I can't imagine what it would have been like to have been in Egypt and experienced watching Egypt go through the times of the plagues. All the things that happened during those times, culminating in that last plague, which was the death of the firstborn. What that would have looked like, what those people would have gone through and what they would have experienced, realizing that God had reached down with a mighty hand and had, within a short period of time, defeated all of the gods of Egypt. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. It wasn't just attacking Egypt itself, it was attacking the religious system of Egypt and showing that the God of the Israelites was superior, more powerful than the gods of Egypt. And in doing that, he took everything that he could. He took everything from them that they held sacred, including the firstborn of their children and their livestock. The firstborn of everything was taken away. And as Israel comes out, they're still processing this, what happened. They also probably are just becoming aware that the Egyptians are going to start pursuing them again. And God says, I want you to do something. I want you to remember what I've done for you. And I want you to do it this way. I want you to consecrate for me the firstborn of everything. All of your livestock, any human in your household, anything, any firstborn male goes to me. It's not yours. And he gave them rules about how to do that. The things, for instance, sheep would be sacrificed. But if it was something that was more valuable in their time, a donkey was more valuable than a sheep because of its value in being a pack animal. If it was a donkey that was a firstborn, you could redeem it by sacrificing a sheep on its behalf. And obviously, children, they would sacrifice animals on their children's behalf. But something had to be sacrificed in order to acknowledge this firstborn blessing that God had given them. Something had to be returned to him. And then later, as they received the law from Mount Sinai and they begin to form the law of their religion, this idea of the tithe became central to what they did. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, if you'll take us to that next slide, God tells them, be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Set aside a tenth of everything. And then bring it into the storehouses. It's hard for us to grasp what that looked like in those days because their wealth was measured in crops and livestock. So can you imagine setting aside a tenth of what you have, especially the crops, and bringing that into the storehouses. Can you imagine the large fields that some of them had? And bringing those crops in, that was no small task. And for some of them, a tenth was no small amount. It was something that took a tremendous effort to bring in. A lot of that was to feed the Levites. The Levites, again, had no, especially when they came into the promised land, when they established themselves as Israel in the land that God gave them, the Levites had no inheritance, and so they needed a way to receive sustenance, to receive food, and they did that through the sacrifices and tithes. Some of that went to the Levites. But a lot of that tithe and a lot of those sacrifices were just burnt up. They were just gone. Consider that for a minute. Take a tenth of what you have, this offering of grain or wine or whatever came from your fields that you had raised, that you had worked to raise to support your family, and you put it on a fire to God. It's perfectly good stuff, whether it be crops or animals or something along those lines, and you just burn it up. It's just gone. You got to think at some point in time, those people had to look at that and say, that's mighty impractical for that just to be gone. But the fact is, God didn't need their crops or their grain. But he did need for them to release something that he had blessed them with, so that they would remember where that came from. So that they would remember that it wasn't because of just their hard work and their toil. It wasn't just because of all that they did and how special they were that things had gone well for them. It was also because God had blessed them. In fact, that was the majority of why. And God wanted to be sure that they always knew and always remembered where that came from. Later on in Malachi chapter 3, after the exiles Israel had been taken into exile, they had been there for a number of years, and then they came back and were rebuilding their temple and their homes in Jerusalem. And Malachi, that's the last book of the Old Testament, and in Malachi, God, through his prophet, says, you all need to remember the tithe. You need to remember the fact that you've been blessed, and it's important that you remember that blessing by blessing others. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, he says, in Malachi chapter 3. Bring it up, and if you don't, he also says, you're robbing God. If you don't bring all that's required into the storehouse, if you don't do your tithing, then you're robbing God. It's important. It was important that they remembered where their blessings came from. That God had given that to them, and that they were to take a portion and remember that. You see, in the Old Testament, the tithe is the standard for giving. It was the standard for generosity. Look at all that you've been given, take 10% of that, and offer that to God, either for the Levites or just in sacrifice to God. Give that back because of what you've been given. In the Old Testament, the standard was the tithe. Does that change in the New Testament? If you'll take us to that next slide. It's kind of a theological question. Think about that a minute. Does the standard of the tithe change in the New Testament? Well, in my view, yes and no. I think you could answer that both ways there and probably make a case either way. Because of the fact, first of all, that the church, the New Testament, those who bore the message of the New Testament, the message of Jesus, were Jews. And so the tithe would have been their standard for what they needed to return to God, and what they needed to give to him, out of their appreciation for what he had done for them. That was their standard. But Paul sets a different standard. I think it's interesting as he writes, and there are a couple of places in both of the Corinthians, both 1st and 2nd Corinthians, where Paul is taking up a collection in order to to take back with him to Jerusalem to help the poor and the struggling there. And he wanted to take an offering from the churches in the diaspora, or in the Gentile areas, back to Jerusalem and bless the Christians back in Jerusalem because they were struggling. Some because of persecution and for a number of other reasons, but they were struggling. And so Paul sets a standard for them for giving. He says, I want you to, and the old King James says to lay by and store, and this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. I want you to lay by and store, but set aside in according with your income a portion that you can give. And in that, he talks about generosity. He could have said, set aside a tenth of what you had. You know that when he's thinking in proportion to your income, because of his Jewish roots, he was thinking a tithe. But he didn't want to limit to that. He didn't want to limit them by this idea, this concept of the tithe. And so he says, set an amount in keeping with your income to give back, to give to God. And then you give that. In chapter 9, the passage that Robin read for us earlier, in chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians, he talks to them again about an offering that they're to take. And in that, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 6, just kind of look at that. Remember this, he says, as he's talked to them about the collection that he's coming to take. Who sows sparingly, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each one of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. The 10% was compulsory. It was something that God said, you got to do that. In the old law, you've got to give 10% of your salary. I think it's interesting again, or whatever your income is. I think it's interesting again that Paul in the New Testament doesn't set that as the standard. He simply says, I want you to appeal to the standard of generosity. And when he says generosity, he means extreme generosity. You remember back in the Gospels, Jesus is outside the temple, and this older lady walks up to the temple where these round coffers where people put in their tithes, the money that they were required to give at the temple. It says while people were putting in these large bags of money, there was a widow that comes along and she puts in 2 copper coins that are only worth a fraction of a penny. He called them mites. It looked like an enormously small offering compared to what others were offering. But Jesus, God in the flesh, stops everything around him and says, I want you to look at that. I want you to see what she's done. Because everybody else is giving out of their wealth, stuff that they can afford to give. She, out of her poverty, just gave everything she had. The woman has nothing else to live on. A couple of things that kind of generosity flows from. One is faith. Generosity, that extreme generosity mentioned in the New Testament always flows first from faith. From an understanding that you are not taking care of you. God is taking care of you, and that's faith. To realize that it's God that's blessed us. It's God that's given us what we have. It's God that's taking care of us. And if we give back to him, even if it's an extreme amount, he's going to take care of us. Faith is what it's about. Another is out of a heart of thankfulness. Faith and thankfulness equals generosity. When I'm thankful for what God has given me, I don't live under the delusion that it's my work or my hard efforts. Everything that I've done has brought me what I have. If we don't have that attitude, instead we think God has given me what I have. God has blessed my work. God has blessed what I've done. And I have what I have not because of me, but because of him. That is an attitude that generosity can flow from. Faith and thankfulness. When we have those two things, we're able to appeal to this New Testament standard of extreme generosity. Jesus recognizes the widow with her mites. In the book of Acts, Luke, the author of Acts, recognizes people like Barnabas who sold land that they had, investment properties that they had, and laid the money at the apostles' feet. An extreme gift even for their day, giving to support the needs of others. That's indicated as an example of extreme generosity. And so when Paul writes to the Corinthians, and he says, I want you to give generously, that whoever sows generously will also reap generously. He's talking about this extreme generosity. It's a tithe plus. This extreme generosity that also trusts that God will take care of us when we're giving back. When we give back from what he's given to us, God's going to take care of us. He's going to see to it that we have what we need. We recognize that God is the supplier of abundance, and we give back to him because he's given to us what we don't deserve. And so we give back from what he's given to us, this portion that reflects our generosity, that flows from our faith and our thankfulness. If you're like me, you realize, you look around the Thanksgiving table and realize the incredible blessings that we have. We also realize that those blessings largely come in the shape of relationships, of family, of friends, of people, and not things. We realize that people in areas of the world who are far less blessed materially than we are have the same joyous celebrations when they gather with family as we do. And that the material things don't really make a lot of difference in those situations. And those blessings indeed are from God. Here's something that as we think in terms of our giving going forward, you know that next Sunday, I believe, is our Harvest Sunday. And we're looking and asking folks not only to give of their regular contribution, but also to look and be willing to give above and beyond that. Be willing to help with the things that our church is doing, and we've shown in a number of videos and in a number of ways, the kinds of ways that our church reaches out to our community and to our world through local efforts, through missions and beyond those things. And that we seek to carry the gospel in those ways to those who need to hear it. And you see that the funds that you give here at church play a role in that. They participate in that. And so it's at this time of the year we ask and remind you that that we depend on your generosity and my generosity to make that work as we move forward. Being generous, giving back what God has given you. Not giving under compulsion, not thinking, well, I've got to do this or something bad's going to happen. But giving because you want to help. Giving because you have faith in knowing that it's God taking care of you and not you. And giving because you're thankful for all that God has done for you. And I know that there are many here today who are regular tithers, that they give that 10% plus. And for you all, we ask that you consider, is there more that you can do? Is there more that you can give to the causes that we support here? We also want to talk to those of you who maybe aren't regular tithers. Those of you who haven't gotten started in that practice, or maybe you started it and kind of fallen back on that. We're, like a lot of churches, the majority of our income comes from those who give a regular amount every week or every month, however they do it. They give it in a check or online. And that regular amount, those regular amount givers makes up about 80% or more of what we take in. And it's also a much smaller percentage of the people who are in attendance. And so we ask that those of you who are affiliated with Westside, you're affiliated with what we do here, and you're on board with our ministry and our local community and beyond, that you consider the idea of tithe plus, of this idea of extreme generosity. You think about what you're giving back that God has blessed you with, and think in terms of what that looks like for you. The tithe is pretty simple. I'm terrible at math, and yet I can get on my calculator, plug in my income, and find out what 10% of that looks like. And then divide that by 52, and that gives me an amount for a check to give every week. I can do that. That's not difficult. Now, some of you have situations where you're not sure what that amount is going to look like at the end of the year. You work on a commission, or you work hourly, and you're not sure how that's going to work out. You may have to do some estimation. I told you my math is terrible, so that's out of my department. You'll have to figure that one out on your own. But what does that look like for you? What does it look like for you to have that kind of extreme generosity? One of the things that some members are doing here that I think is a great idea is they're doing the automatic withdrawal thing. They work that out through their bank. They have an amount that comes from their bank, and some of it gets sent directly to Westside. They don't even see it. And it's a good way to do it so that you don't even have to worry about, oh, did I bring the checkbook? Oh, I'm out of checks. That happens sometimes. But this is a way where it happens on a regular basis, and you really don't have to put a lot of thought into it. You just tell them the amount, and they'll send it. Whatever that means for you, though, I ask you to think about tithing. Think about worshiping God in what you give back to him. Worshiping God in faith and in thankfulness. Giving back to him for the abundance that he's blessed you with. Come to the point of the lesson this morning where we think about where our walk with God is. Where is our walk with Jesus? How is our life becoming more and more like him? And at the end of our lessons here at Westside, we like to give everyone an opportunity to make changes that they need to make. If they've gotten away from what they know they need to do, whether it be in worship or in thankfulness or in giving or whatever that is. We want to offer this opportunity for you to move back in the direction that you know you need to go. We have people around the room who will be praying for you, with you, or for someone else. If there's someone in your life, someone you know of who needs our prayers, meet with those people. Pray with them. The content of those prayers will be confidential unless you want it shared with the church. And then we'll share it. But know that you've got someone that you can go with who will be praying with you and for you about whatever it is you need. If this morning is a morning that you want to make that initial commitment to God who's given you so much, where you want to be baptized into the blood of his Son, having your sins washed away and then rising to walk in a newness of life, we want to give you that opportunity as well. I ask you to respond to this lesson in some way, shape, or form. Respond knowing the abundance God has blessed you with. The season of Thanksgiving reminds us of all that we have because of him. And in doing so, we want to give back. Whatever we can do to help you, we'd like to do that. Zach's going to sing this song to encourage us, and we'd ask you to let one of us know as we stand and sing this song. Father God, just for today,